Good evening, and welcome to Making Michigan, the Bentley Historical Library's series on the history of the University of Michigan. I'm Andrew Rutledge, the Bentley's in-house historian, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all tonight, either in person or virtually, to the historic Judy and Stanley Frankel Detroit Observatory, a division here of the Bentley. And I'd like to extend a very special welcome this evening to all of the U of M alumni who have joined us this evening, and want to thank the Alumni Association of the University of Michigan's Lifelong Learning Program for the very kind co-sponsorship of tonight's program. And tonight, we have a very exciting and very timely talk. For March Madness, the annual pair of tournaments, each featuring 64 teams playing to determine the national champions of men's and women's basketball, are kicking off this week. The Michigan's women's team plays tomorrow afternoon right here in Ann Arbor, and our men will kick off in Buffalo, New York later this evening, a fact that I hope will cause none of you to run screaming out the door that you've forgotten. But if both teams do as well as we all hope, they will travel across the country in the coming weeks, playing a whole series of games to determine a national champion. Now, these tournaments are just particularly noteworthy examples of the high-profile national sporting events that have helped make the University of Michigan a household name across the country and around the world. Many of those games and the seasons they're parts of are celebrated as part of the university's proud traditions. But our speaker tonight will be sharing lesser-known stories of U of M athletics and about our long and proud tradition of international sporting competition, a tradition that dates back to the very founding of U of M football and stretches to at least 5 of the 7 continents. And there is no one better to tell these stories than the Bentley's Archivist for Athletics, Jay Winkler. A lifelong Michigan sports fan, he has earned his undergraduate degree from Albion College and his master's degree right here at U of M. He's worked as an archivist for the Inter-University Consortium for Social and Political Research before joining the Bentley and living his dream as our Archivist for Athletics. Now, I would argue his mastery of all the details of U of M sports is probably greatly helped by his lifelong interest in trivia and game shows, a fact that has led him to recently be a contestant on the TV show The Floor with Rob Lowe. So please join me in welcoming Jay Winkler.
Is it on now? Oh. Good evening, and thank you for coming. My name is Jay Winkler, and I'm the Archivist for Athletics at the Bentley Historical Library. I'm excited to be here talking about the international history of the Michigan Wolverines. It's a good time as any to talk about any shifts in the landscape of college athletics, and it was almost an even better time to be discussing this one specifically, but we'll get there. First, for the benefit of the many, many people here tonight who are new to archives, what exactly is the Archivist for Athletics? So I am tasked with collecting records, documents, and other material from the history of Michigan athletics, making that material available to researchers, and then assisting those researchers with their queries based on Michigan athletics. And I use the term researchers really broadly. Certainly it can mean what you're imagining, people hunched over books, hunched over boxes, doing academic research for a big project. But the Bentley Historical Library is fully open to the public. You should come. And as Archivist for Athletics, most of my researchers are people looking for pictures of their grandparents or trying to substantiate a stat, or former players planning reunions or making scrapbooks. One of my most frequent researchers is the athletic department itself. I work very closely with their communications and their social media staffs. I host teams at the library. I help them with their record books. One other thing I want to say about my job itself is that almost every specialty public sector archivist in this country can tell you exactly how their position is funded. And my position is half funded directly by the athletic department. I say that not just to brag, but also because to emphasize, it's important for me to emphasize the care and importance that the athletic department itself assigns to their history. There are not many people who have a job like mine, and among us, my model, where I have direct buy-in from the AD, is completely unique. I really believe it says something about the University of Michigan and perhaps something about Wolverine fandom writ large that this position has existed with basically this exact model for well over 30 years. This also seems like as good of a time as any to thank the Alumni Association for their co-sponsorship of this talk. If you were at the Alum 101 event the other day and now you are at this talk, you should sincerely reach out to the Alumni Association and tell them that it's working. Finally, I plan on being at least halfway through QA by tip-off at 7:10. In retrospect, we should have done this next month, but here we are. In June of 2025, it was leaked that Michigan was seriously exploring playing their 2026 season opener in Frankfurt, Germany. The university immediately confirmed the basic truth of this, though it was not finalized. Fan base reactions were, I'm probably being a little bit generous to the athletic department if I say they were mixed. We had another version of the same conversations we've been having for the whole modern era of college football. What is the point of all this to the university itself? Are the people in the stands still important for college football? Does this even really make sense on the revenue side? All of those. I am, let's start here, just as obsessed with this stuff as most of you are, so my first reaction was as a fan. I hated it a lot less than a lot of people, but I can't say I was thrilled about my season ticket strip having one less home game, and it just all seemed like it was happening far quicker than technically necessary. My second reaction was about the same as my reaction to anything new in college athletics. I start to think about what sort of precedents we can find in history. I would say that one of my biggest philosophies as a college sports fan is that nothing is new. Surely I'm not immune to frustrations over player and coach movement or whatever excesses exist in the NIL era. But in general, I think the biggest difference between the current era and the previous is sunlight. Now, it is reasonable to say that me saying, well, actually it's always been this bad isn't the most inspiring message, but it does help me when I'm trying to sort through what I think is new and perhaps dangerous to what we love about college athletics and what is just college sports being college sports. Well, again, I think we can all admit a regular season contest is different in some way. You know, during those first Harbaugh foreign trips, during the Harbaugh era, my main reaction was that football was finally doing what many other sports had done for years. So today we're going to talk about some specific instances of Michigan traveling internationally historically. This is not necessarily meant to be a comprehensive overview of every time it's ever happened, but I want to play with some of the fun ones. First, we'll look at Michigan football in the 1880s. If you want to find a precedent for the football team playing outside the US, you do not have to get very far past the very beginning and the Canadian influences on early Michigan football. Next, we'll talk about baseball's home and homes in Japan in the 20s and 30s. I'll look at a basketball trip taken through the Mediterranean and my ongoing efforts to collect materials from that trip. And finally, I'll give a 1,000-foot view of how some sports travel all the time and talk about whether or not I think Michigan's ever going to do that trip. I'm also just going to get this out of the way. This is a picture of the 1903 Michigan-Indiana game at Ferry Field. Really has nothing to do with the rest of the talk, but it had the right vibes. Let's begin at the beginning. In the fall of 1878, the Racine College Football Association challenged Michigan's Football Association to a contest. As noted by Irving Pond, a rusher in that first game, Racine's 11 was writing to a team that only existed for inter-class competition and did not begin to take this contest seriously until weeks before it happened. The game took place at Chicago's White Stocking grounds on May 30th of 1879 on the site of what is now Millennium Park. Michigan won 1-0. Here you can see Racine's letter as it was printed in the Chronicle, a pre-Michigan Daily biweekly student newspaper that ran from 1867 to 1890. Racine College was in Wisconsin, thus making the neutral Chicago make sense for both parties, and it is the first recorded intercollegiate football game west of Philadelphia. I've chosen my words very carefully here. These are not the first two college football teams west of Philadelphia, nor is this the first college football game held west of Philadelphia, but in 1876, Northwestern had a team, and they had a home loss to the Chicago Football Club, 2 years later, Michigan and Racine met in Northwestern's backyard and played the first game between two Western colleges. While we're here, maybe some of you are like me, and the fact that Michigan's first game was against Racine is a fact that stuck in your head for like a good 15, 20 years before you realized you had never met anyone who went to Racine, and finally looked it up, and it closed in 1933. I found that out after I started this job. The second game of the 1879 season, and by extension, program history, occurred after the summer break and gets at our topic today. Michigan targeted the University of Toronto for their second contest, and there was some negotiation with Toronto as to who would host the game. Toronto claimed that they could not afford the travel to Detroit for the game, while Michigan insisted on playing the nominal host. The matter got settled between publication of two issues of the Chronicle, unfortunately, but neither of these teams are the right team. It is a team 10 years before and 10 years after, which was the best I could do in the University of Toronto archives. Ultimately, the game happened in Detroit, and on November 1st, 1879 at Recreation Park. Recreation Park was on the campus on what is now the campus of the Detroit Medical Center, and at the time was primarily hosting minor league baseball. The Major League Detroit Wolverines would join the National League a few years later, and Recreation Park was demolished in 1893 after they folded. Per the Detroit Free Press, a number of Canadian excursionists and Ann Arbor students arrived in Detroit and participated in some generalized merriment the night before the game, with more students arriving from Ann Arbor that morning. The Free Press account of the game has the headline, Rugby, which is the title of the game to be played at Recreation Park on Saturday. And I have a lot to say about how standards to write a headline have changed, but the thing we're going to focus on right this second is that they called it rugby. Now, I have strategically hidden some information for narrative effect, which is that Racine did the same thing. Their letter was from a football association. Football is hyphenated in this instant, but it did say, we play according to modified rugby rules, which we'll be able to send you in printed form in about a week. Now I think is a good time to pause and ask an important question. What is football? So I'm going to define some terms really quickly. Football, broadly speaking, is any game played on a field between about 100 and 150 yards with a goal at each end, where the object is to get the ball through the goal without using an implement of sport, such as a stick or a bat, to get it through the goal. A football code is any one of the major varieties of football, association, Australian, Gaelic, a couple of different types of rugby, and then gridiron football, which is what American football falls under, because they used to have the grid on the field. What distinguishes the types of gridiron football is that the yard lines serve an in-game function. Pre-code football, before all the football codes started diverging, and especially in the US, is mostly a number of similar games that are really broadly defined as mob football, where a more or less infinite number of offensive players would try to push the ball over a line, defended by a more or less infinite number of defenders. This is true in Ann Arbor, where prior to the first football team, there is plenty of Chronicle reporting about interclass mob football, and games that are kind of like it persist in interclass form well into the 1920s on Michigan's campus. Something that's pretty well established among college football historians is that Princeton-Rutgers, which is often cited as the first college football game in 1869, was an association football game. Association football later got a very British nickname where they borrowed the middle letters to form soccer. It is widely believed that anyone who watched the first college football game would just recognize it as soccer. On May 14th and 15th of 1874, a McGill team traveled from Montreal to Cambridge for a two-game series with Harvard. The first was played under a very early football code called the Boston game, and the second was played under McGill's rules, the rugby rules. This game would have been more or less legible to a modern fan of rugby union. Most of the Eastern schools at the time were still playing something closer to association football, and the Crimson so enjoyed the rugby match that it became the catalyst for Harvard, talking the others into picking up the oblong ball and running with it. The gridiron codes began developing from there, with the Ivies slowly integrating their own innovations into the rugby rules, many of which were spurred by Walter Camp, resetting the ball at the line of scrimmage, limiting drives to a certain number of plays, and later making those plays renewable if distance targets were met, down and distance, and crucially, 11 aside. So what is Michigan playing? This is way too much text on the slide, and I'm aware of that, but it's for effect. So about a year before the first challenge from Racine, the Chronicle printed the full rules of rugby. It took them 3 full issues to complete their printing of the laws of football governing rugby union clubs. There was obviously a lot more other content in the issues. The one page where it's full page, that's the only time it took a full page. They're really confusing. They seem to spend way more time just defining terms than technically necessary, and this scan of them is a little bit difficult to read, but plays start with a scrimmage where someone puts the ball on the ground, players surround it and try to kick it out of the scrum towards their goal line. The ball cannot be touched in a scrimmage, but once it's out of there, someone can pick it up and start running it. When the player gets tackled, you kind of start it over again. There are specific rules about who can tackle and when, and whether or not you're allowed to pile on and when. Back passes are lawful, forward passes are not. You get a try at goal if you touch down the ball in the opposing end zone, and games are solely decided based on who has more goals scored in this fashion. The try is far more important than the touchdown at this time in history. One thing also worth noting is that the 11 aside versus 15 aside debate raged on in the East, with Yale favoring 11 and Harvard favoring 15. The Chronicle rules actually appear to be agnostic on this point, but Michigan won the Racine game 1-0 via Irving Pond scoring a touchdown and David Detar converting the subsequent goal to get the actual point. We would not have gotten the point unless he makes the conversion. The game out against Toronto and Detroit plays out really chaotically, and neither side scores, though both sides get close. The Free Press notes that 7/8 of the crowd did not know the rules and printed them in enough detail that we're pretty confident that the Toronto game, the Racine game, had the same rules. At the time of the Toronto game in Detroit, a return trip was promised. The Chronicle reported that Toronto was actually meant to play Harvard that fall, and Michigan was kind of hoping to use a mutual opponent to prove that they were ready for Eastern competition. Thus, on November 5th, 1880, Michigan's 11 met with Toronto's once again, this time at the Toronto Lacrosse Club on what is the site of what is now a residential area near the University of Toronto. So it's Michigan's first ever away game and Michigan's first international game. We started right at the beginning and we made it to game 3 in program history before we play an international one. The actual manner of play was pretty similar to the game in Detroit. It's rugby, but the conditions are terrible, and serious discussion was made of postponing the match. The ground was slippery and muddy, the water stood in pools, the ball was soon heavy, and in short, circumstances were decidedly against good playing or enjoyment of it. People, even though the Chronicle said that circumstances were against enjoying the game, plenty of people showed up from both sides. All right, so there are not a lot of disputed games in the history of Michigan football. There are a couple with Stevens and Oberlin where both sides claim a victory over refereeing disagreements in the 1800s. The University of Michigan and the University of Toronto have no substantive dispute over what happened at the Toronto Lacrosse Club. Michigan's John Chase scored a touchdown, but the try was missed. William Calvert scored the second touchdown, and Frank Allen converted the try. Toronto was forced to take 3 safety touchdowns. All of these things are agreed upon by both sides. Michigan won, scoring 2 touchdowns and a try to Toronto's none. The universities do record the final score differently. So 2 touchdowns and a missed extra point for Michigan, that's 13 points. 3 safeties for Toronto, that's 6 points, right? We all know that. But no contemporary source lists the score like that. The Chronicle, Toronto's Globe and Mail, and University of Toronto's Varsity, their Chronicle equivalent, they all just list the score similarly to how I did before. 2 touchdowns and a goal to none. By this time, the Chronicle had reported that the Eastern schools had established that touchdowns would be worth more than goals. And it's a little hard to understand what rule set the Wolverines believed that they were operating under here. But the result is the same. Toronto doesn't score. But what's really noticeable here is how Toronto lists the score. So this is Toronto's record book for the same year. 0 to 1 goal and 2 touchdowns. Their only loss of the season. The safeties don't even get mentioned. The Michigan record book explains how scoring works in 1882 and in all subsequent changes. But prior to that, the Michigan record book just kind of leaves you on your own. The only way to get to 13-6 is just to apply post-1912 scoring rules and call it a day. And I frankly think it would be more fun if we just had an old weird score in the record books like Toronto does. One last thing before we go home. The Toronto-Harvard match never happened. And the Toronto varsity student paper suggests that most of the reason it didn't happen is that Toronto just did not think they were good enough to make it worth both teams' time. Michigan did not play another Canadian opponent until 1885. In the intervening seasons, they lost to Harvard twice, Yale once, finally going east. They play the disputed game against Stevens and defeat my alma mater, Albion, in the first of their 17 matchups. Albion wins 1. It is a victory at Albion. In the meantime, Michigan adopts such innovations as plays from scrimmage, snapping the ball from center, and field goals. In May of 1885, the Michigan Argonaut, a Chronicle rival that had sprung up by then, reported that a May 9th game against a club team from Windsor got canceled the day of, as Windsor refused to send a team if Michigan insisted on playing the 11-man game, where they still preferred the 15. But fall 1885 rolls around, and Michigan still needs an opponent. So a home-and-home with the Windsor Club from the Ontario Rugby Football Union, a precursor of the CFL, gets scheduled. And on November 7th, 1885, 2 years and 2 days after their last foray to Canada, the Michigan team headed to Windsor. The previous Canadian game was played under some sort of rugby-heavy combination of the rugby and gridiron codes, and since Canada was not as quick to adopt the new rules, rugby still ruled, and the hosts wanted to play their version. Michigan has scored in a lot of ways. I once watched Jabril Peppers pick up a ball at Spartan Stadium and run it back 90 yards for a defensive two-point conversion. Anthony Carter did the thing where he danced into the end zone. Lloyd Carr stole a second from Penn State, and it was the second that Henny used to get the ball to Manningham. But we have also scored a rouge, and I want to talk about it. So the Chronicle notes that one of the major differences, a lot of the major differences between Windsor's rules, one of the biggest is that in Canada they were still favoring the try. They were still favoring the goal as the primary scoring event. But during the first inning of that game, a player named Bishop, with no confirmed first name, acquired the ball just short of the Windsor goal line and after a throw-in by the ref. He tried to kick the ball into the goal from open play to score a field goal, but the ball sailed through the back of the end zone without going through the uprights. 1 point for Michigan. Michigan has scored field goals, touchdowns, safeties, and a rouge. So for the uninitiated, the rouge is a way to score a single point in Canadian football. Any legal kick that is not successfully caught in advance from the end zone by the receiving team is a rouge. So if a receiver, they field the punt or they field the kickoff, they need to get out of the end zone in Canada. Otherwise, the other team scores a point. Or if a missed field goal or long punt just sails out of the end zone, you also get a point in Canadian football. And when Bishop missed his kick but had distance to spare, Michigan was awarded 1 point. Earlier in that half, James Duffy had scored for open play field goal for 6, and then another rouge put Michigan up 8-0 at the half. There were 2 rouges for Windsor in the second half for an 8-2 final. Windsor feted Michigan with a banquet, and the Argonaut asked its readers to return the hospitality. They did, And when they hosted the Ann Arbor banquet a week later, the Windsor boys really tried to convince Michigan to keep practicing the Canadian game. And at the time, the Chronicle agreed that it would be nice if we were able to play Windsor and Hamilton and Toronto, given that those places were just as easy for us to get to as any of the Eastern schools. I do also want to say the kickoff through the end zone was actually just this year legislated out of Canadian football. You can no longer, as recently as last year, you could score a single point by just bombing the ball through the goalpost. Also, no one's 100% sure why they're called a rouge. They've always been called that, but the CFL rules have always formally called it a single. It would seem the story ends here, but Michigan football has not played a game on international soil since. But I do want to go 1 week further to Windsor's trip back to Ann Arbor. Prior to that, Michigan had just played their home contest at the Washtenaw County Fairgrounds, but the field conditions were inconsistent, and the trip was not short in 1885. So for Windsor's game at Michigan, the Rugby Association made a major decision. The game would be played on campus. The Argonaut noted that management found an easier time getting the campus community to contribute to cover the costs rather than a game at the fairgrounds, and said that a game on the campus has all the spirits of genuine college playing. Maybe that's the end of the Canadian influence on Michigan football, but I think hosting the first true away game, the first true home game, and also possibly introducing the United States to the good version of football in the first place is a legacy worth recognizing. Perhaps more than any other sport, baseball fans are history completists. I don't think it's a coincidence that the most detailed of any of the single sport record books on mgoblue.com is the baseball record book. I think it's a natural consequence of that sports information director getting a lot of weird questions over the years. It's fun to scroll through some of the teams they played in the early years. In 1868, they played the Detroits. They played the Jackson Mutual. They played the Detroit Athletic Club a lot. They play Albion. And then in 1911, something that looks a little odd happens. The pair closes their season with a pair of exhibition wins at home over Keio University in Japan, that's Keio. In 1921, they welcome Waseda. In 1924, Meiji University, and then a Japanese all-star team in 1925. Keio University is one of the best clubs in Japanese collegiate baseball. This is actually Waseda because it's a picture from the right year. This is Waseda 1911. We played Keio in 1911, but I wanted a picture from 1911. But they were one of the best clubs in Japanese collegiate baseball in 1911. They're one of the best clubs in Japanese collegiate baseball today. And the 1911 tour wasn't by any means the first tour of U.S. colleges by the Keio Nine, but it was the first to come to Michigan. Keio, Waseda, and Meiji had almost annual stints between the three of them. There was always one of them here, mostly on the West Coast. But in 1907, a Japanese-based expat wrote his old coach, Amos Alonzo Stagg, and Chicago got added to the rotation. The Midwest became a huge staple on these cross-country tours, and Ann Arbor started being involved. In 1911, the Michigan Daily coverage of a 20-5 win over Keio gives the Japanese team a lot of credit for playing through the jet lag, and says that if not for fewer defensive errors, it would probably have been a close game, even though it was 20-5. There's also some coverage of the banquet that I will not be reading aloud, but I promise you it is generally complimentary in tone, if not language. The next day's contest is a 3-1 Michigan win, and that story spends a lot of time dwelling on an absolutely horrible call that would have netted a second Keio run, and apparently the Michigan crowd treated the umpire like he had denied a Wolverine run. Waseda's visit in 1922 is still a sweep, but a much closer aggregate score, 2-1 Michigan, 1-0 Michigan. This time the Daily notes how good the Japanese fielding is. So the second of the game allowed Captain Pete Van Boven to break the scoreless tie and finish his career in a walk-off home run. But it's really Meiji University's visit in 1924 that sets the stage for their return trip. The baseball is baseball. Michigan wins 16-1, and that game gets your standard Michigan Daily recap. The 10-1 game the next day gets completely washed out of the Daily by commencement. But Meiji gets a taste of Midwestern hospitality, and in 1929 decides to return the favor, writing a letter to Coach Ray Fisher, inviting his team to Meiji University to play some ball, compliments of the Japanese Ministry of Education. The letter asks his team to be ambassadors of goodwill, and Fisher takes it to the Board of Control of Intercollegiate Athletics, and they agree, provided Michigan can secure in writing a guarantee that all of their expenses will be covered by the Japanese, and that we would be paying Meiji the normal half gate for the two proposed games in Ann Arbor the spring before the trip. Finally, because the trip will certainly last beyond the beginning of the fall semester, they resolve to discuss that aspect of the situation with the faculty. At some point it gets sorted out. A couple of these players actually end up missing football season. The stands are packed for both of the games in, where am I? Yeah, okay, the stands are packed for both of the games in Ann Arbor prior to the trip, and Michigan wins both games 3-2. The Michigan Daily notes that game one is a true pitcher's duel, with Michigan not notching its winning tally until the 9th. But the games occurred between the non-conference season and the Big Ten season. The Wolverines go 7-2 in Big Ten play and win the conference, and about 6 weeks after the season ended, they travel cross-country by train, stopping in Washington for a handful of games with local and military clubs. Finally, on August 14th, they boarded the SS Shinyo Maru, headed for Japan, though they did take the opportunity to get off the boat and win an exhibition with the University of Hawaii on their way. A lot of what we have available to us about this first Japanese trip is a pair of articles written for the Michigan alumnus, one by Captain-elect Harvey Straub, the other by Fred Asbeck, who's not the guy in the other picture. I just liked the other picture. Both are players on the 1920 team. Straub claims that in Hawaii, a Michigan athletic team plays its first game outside the boundaries of America, which one, reminds us that Hawaii statehood is pretty recent, all things considered, and two, as we know, is simply not the case. He is wrong. It is not the first time a Michigan athletic team plays outside of America. I really don't think Straub is using a Canada-inclusive definition of America. They arrive in Yokohama on August 30th of 1929 and travel to Tokyo. Straub spells it with an I instead of a Y, where they are treated to the Imperial Hotel, which per Straub is the best hotel in the Orient. After taking in the architecture, they play baseball. Despite the long journey, Michigan scores for 4 runs in their very first inning against Meiji, and over the course of the doubleheader produces a 7-2 win and a 3-2 shutout over their hosts. The next day, Michigan took its first ever loss against a Japanese club, a 4-2 contest against Waseda, who would go on to win the Japan series that year. Straub notes that the consistent drizzle did not dampen the spirits of the Japanese fans, and well over 100,000 attended the first series of games. It's like a 10,000 seater, but there's a bunch of games. Some of you are aware that the Block M anywhere in the world can net you a Go Blue. Apparently this was already more or less the case in 1929 Japan. Everywhere they go, they are greeted warmly by Michigan alumni clubs with banquets and sukiyaki dinners. Asbeck said that the most satisfying fact about the trip we made to Japan is the realization that the alumni of Michigan were proud of us wherever we went. The boys couldn't help but keep the special warmth and sincerity in their welcome, and that inexplicable something that tells you better than words that your host is gratified with the way in which you are conducting yourself. And in fact, both players talk about the importance of conducting yourself a lot. Previous American collegiate teams that had been to Japan had reportedly upset the locals with their brash attitudes in public and open arguing with umpires on the fields, which is a big Japanese faux pas, and to some degree is to this day, actually. Michigan took it upon themselves to adopt Japanese customs towards umpires, and gained the love of the crowds for their trouble. When the Wolverines got to Japan and saw the skepticism that the boys could behave, they saw it as a bit of a challenge. And if their own counts are to believe, behave they did. Michigan went 11-2 in Japan in 1929. Of the baseball, Straub says that Japanese college pitchers are not as good as the ones they face in the US, but as always, compliments their fielding. As they were leaving, an AP correspondent said he believed that they were sure to get a return invitation soon enough. And in fact, they did, returning in 1932, though in the interest of time, I'm not going to talk about that one today. I do want to get into one more thing from the 1929 trip, and that is the unusual prize that the Meiji and the Ministry, Meiji University and the Ministry of Education gave to Michigan to commemorate the trip. So this is a samurai suit from the late Edo period, sometime in the first half of the 1800s. It seems that the Japanese government, correctly, assumed that Michigan had all of the banners and trophies that they could ask for and wanted to give them something they certainly did not have. When they arrived home with the suit of samurai armor, athletic director Fielding Yost decided it was a personal gift and apparently planned to display it in his living room. Whether or not that ended up being the case, shortly after his death, Mrs. Yost donated it to the nascent Michigan Historical Collections, later the Bentley Historical Library. And by some series of events, it ended up in the place where it actually belongs, which is the University Museum of Anthropological Archaeology. At one point, it was on display, but in order to preserve the object, it is now in storage at a large storage facility that houses material for a bunch of university museums. So last summer, I did get to go look at it. Undergraduate Pikert Fellow Nathan Schreck organized a little field trip out there, and the Anthropology Museum, they showed us so the two pictures or the one where it's in the box and the picture of its helmet, those are my pictures. The other one is the Anthropological Museum's official picture of the specimen. So we're approaching the 100th anniversary of that very first Japan trip, and the samurai suit is in need of a little conservation work. The Japanese government has grants to temporarily return materials like this to Japan so that their conservators can perform the process there with the traditional materials, using the traditional methods. And the Anthropology Museum is seriously considering exploring that program. We're in the very, very, very early stages of a collaboration between the Bentley and the Anthropology Museum to celebrate the anniversary. And I know that on the museum side, they would really like to involve their counterparts at a similar museum at Meiji University. So I'm not sure exactly what that collaboration is going to look like, but maybe I'll see you in this room in 3 years and 1 month from tonight to tell you about it. So on July 31st, 1965, a plane set out from Metro Detroit, headed to Egypt. They were headed out for a month-long tour of the Mediterranean where Dave Strack and his defending Big Ten championship team, they had just lost the NCAA title game. They played their home games at the Yost Fieldhouse, as they would for 2 more seasons. Chrysler hadn't been built. And All-American Cazzie Russell was on the plane headed into his senior year alongside Bill Button and Oliver Darden. The trip was sponsored by the Department of State and had 4 stops: Egypt, Turkey, Greece, and Algeria. They spent roughly a week in each country, seeing sights, exchanging culture, and playing basketball with the locals. Strack said that the original goal of the trip was to expose to these countries a very fine basketball team in order to develop the sport of basketball around the world. And I think this is perhaps the last time a Michigan coach made the argument that an international tour was meant to expose the world to his team and not the other way around. Michigan played 3 games in Egypt against local clubs in Cairo, Port Said, and Alexandria. Per the Michigan Daily, they won all 3 by comfortable margins, with the AP reporting a 73-64 final score against Cezira Sporting Club in a game held under floodlight at the Cezira Club's outdoor court on Nile Island. In 2026, English sources typically spelled Gezira or Jazira with a G at the beginning, and they call the island Zamalek. But to this day, Jazira is a sporting club in Egypt whose basketball team won the championship as recently as 2019. The team moved on to Turkey, where it hosted clinics. There's a nugget from this AP story from when their bus broke down in Istanbul. It says, 11 giants in gym shorts trooped down a dimly lit cobblestone street in ancient Istanbul one night last week. Turks, mouths agape, stared in amazement at what looked like an invasion of mysterious supermen. And while I would imagine we'd scorn a modern writer for acting like the local populace was so unsophisticated, I do think it's fair to admit that anywhere in the world, if you see 11 guys at an average height of 6'5" walking down the street, it is quite a sight. They do win one game against a Turkish club by 30. So sometimes two different sources will lead you to different understandings of an event. Per the AP, on August 19th of 1965, the University of Michigan's touring basketball team played to an 82-82 tie with AEK of Athens tonight. The Greeks, apparently satisfied with a tie, declined to play overtime. When Dave Strack tells the story to the Michigan Daily, towards the end of the game, some fans become upset with the way the American referee is calling the game. Things begin to get out of hand. That's a direct quote from Strack. And when the score was tied 78-78, again, a different version of the story than what we have in the AP, the Greeks refused to play overtime. Strack thought his team handled the situation with aplomb and thought some of the boys from Greeks may have regretted it later on in the night. They travel to Algiers, where the AP just called the AP, they beat a team 83-41. The AP just says an Algerian team with no further specification. In the end, Michigan closes the trip at 6-0 and one tie, which Strack felt good about from the basketball side and on the Making Worlds connection side. Ahmed Badawi is a photographer who was operating in Alexandria, Egypt from the 1940s until the 2000s. His photography showcases a wide range of everyday scenes, political rallies, weddings, and sporting events. After his death, his grandson worked with archivists on a project to digitize and exhibit his 70 years of local history around Egypt. They have thousands and thousands of negatives, and I am extremely interested in 15 of them. I'm going to spoil the ending here. There is no grand reveal. I do not have the pictures. But not so long after starting my job, the Badawi Archive Project reached out to me, hoping to come to some sort of agreement by which we could acquire the pictures from them. Badawi had photographed the game in Alexandria against Jazira on the outdoor court under floodlights. Recently, I got a scrapbook in the mail, and I promise I'm going somewhere with this. It's from the family of Quentin Sickles, a player on the 1947 National Championship football team. And the scrapbook is full of pictures he took on the team's trip to the Rose Bowl that year, along with some other interesting memorabilia you could only get from a player in that area. Like Badawi, I started talking to the Sickles family shortly after I started in this job, and like Badawi, they were initially reluctant to give up their grandfather's stuff. They just liked knowing in the back of their heads that maybe one day there was someone they could send their materials to who would take care of it. My first step was to leave them alone. I was always clear in our communication and that there was no rush on my end. The archive will still be here when they're ready. And once our initial conversation reached its natural endpoint, I stopped having it for over 6 months. When I reached out to them again to remind them there's no rush, but I'm still here, 8 months later, my contact and their family had a few questions. I was clear about what we wanted, how the material might get organized once it's here, and often just as important, I was honest about what I didn't want and what was just as likely to end up in my separation pile as their trash. One day, I got an email that the package was in the mail. I honestly thought we were at least 6 months away from that, but I was able to get this family to trust that I would take care of their grandfather's items and that when they come to Ann Arbor with the next generation, the items would be there for them to explore again. I can't exactly pull the same trick with the Badawi family, partly because it's sort of hard to tell who I'm talking to that is a partner of the project or who is a direct descendant. It's hard to tell if these people have different goals whether some of the requests I've received are coming from a genuine belief in the value of their materials or an opportunistic assumption that an American archive had money to throw around. I'm not talking to a single contact that I can convince to trust me, like often when I'm trying to acquire family materials. The Bentley is not historically in the business of purchasing materials, and I do not say that to cast any aspersions. Clemens purchases materials all the time. It's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. But a few months ago, when I found out there might be a little bit of funding to do so, my eyes widened because I knew I had a year-old email sitting in my inbox from when we had last reached our stalemate. And this material had become a bit of a personal white whale. So I know for a fact that Kazi is in these images, and I know that because that's how they pitched it to me. I'm reasonably confident that no other pictures of them actually playing basketball on the trip exist. There are enough stories in the AP Newswire, and none of them have AP pictures attached. And I do have a respect for the Badawi's position. They are reluctant to share what they consider important family and local history with an American institution whose intentions they don't know. Certainly, probably at the University of Michigan's Anthropology Museum, there is a long history of Western institutions deciding that Egyptian material belonged to them now. And when I assign the best of intentions to the Badawi Archive Project, I am in a silent battle against that history. But ultimately, where we are as far apart is on money, and that's what is most frustrating to me. To be honest, I'm not exactly sure what I am and not supposed to say, given that this is an active negotiation. But I wish I could convince them that I'm merely a fellow traveler in the archival space, certainly better resourced, but not without my own limits. I want the photographs because I think they would make a significant contribution to our understanding of this era of Michigan basketball. There's a part of me that's resistant to continuing to push for more funds. I think the Bentley leadership has actually been really generous with their offer. It's a number larger than what I would have picked for 15 pictures. And there's another part of me that knows how transformative a small amount of money can be right here at an archive in Ann Arbor, and could only imagine the impact it could have on their project. I don't think there's a right answer. I think all I can do is continue to respect their project and gain a little trust. But if for some reason you are now as obsessed with seeing these pictures as me and are interested in supporting, my email's not hard to find. I'd be remiss here if I didn't take a detour to mention that Michigan men's basketball played an international regular season game like really recently. In 2019, Michigan scheduled a 3-game series with Kentucky. They were to play December 2020 in London, and then the following 2 years at the Chrysler Center and Rupp Arena. Certainly, at the time the 2020 game was canceled, it would have been very difficult to predict that the only one of those 3 games to happen was going to be the game in London when Michigan lost there in 2022. Hi, Hunter. Perhaps, ironically, it's almost harder to catalog all the times Michigan has done something like this in the modern era than it is in the previous era. The NCAA has rules allowing any team to take a trip every 4 years, and now many teams do take that trip every 4 years. In 2010, the NCAA adjusted the rules so that incoming freshmen could travel with their teams, and as recently as last summer, men's lacrosse went to Spain, volleyball went to Italy and Greece, and women's soccer went to Sweden and Denmark. If you're a coach, the appeal isn't just the learning and the cultural exchange. You get 10 bonus summer practices, and often some of those are actually just full exhibitions against pro teams. So this is a pretty close to comprehensive list of all of the NCAA-sanctioned foreign trips that involved countable practices or international exhibitions under the model that I was just discussing. It's pretty close anyways. These are the programs that tend to go. For the most part, teams go to Europe, but when the volleyball team went to Argentina in 2013, they finally checked South America off of the list of continents on which Michigan had visited and played a game. Most of these have a really similar structure. You go sightseeing, you play some European teams in their very, very nice facilities. Maybe you have a social with the European teams, and then one of your players writes a blog for mgoblue.com. In 2019, softball took a pretty unique one by going to Cuba over fall break. By contrast to the European trips and their pro facilities, they knew in Cuba they would almost exclusively, well, not almost, in Cuba they would exclusively play teams that simply did not have the resources that the University of Michigan has. And in fact, the team traveled to Cuba prepared to leave a good portion of their playing gear behind, knowing that Nike would take care of them just fine in a couple of months. They also brought toiletries and other items and gave those. And then, of course, laid by the pool, went to a cigar plantation. In some ways, it reminded me of the old trips where there was no disputing that the sport was secondary. My big list slide did something intentional that you probably didn't notice, but I included the 2017 football trip to Italy, but not the 2018 trip to France or the 2019 trip to South Africa. If you do not recall, in Italy, the football team participated in 3 practices at the Roma football facility, one of which was open to the public. In order to have those practices, they had to count them against their 15 allowable spring practices. God forbid a Michigan program slightly exceed their countable hours. Italy had a very similar itinerary as a volleyball or basketball trip for the football team. Whereas in France and South Africa in subsequent years, those trips occurred fully after spring ball. They were pure experiential learning trips with no organized practice, though they did hold some youth clinics. And I think if they had done anything formal, the NCAA wouldn't have allowed them to do it in 3 straight years. In the NIL era, these trips are under threat. As departments figure out how to pay for revenue sharing, these trips are an easy thing to put on the chopping block. The romantic in me says that I hope that Wolverines are able to continue to take part in the grand tradition that I've laid out for us tonight. But the cynic in me says that, when you're legally bound not to make a profit, and also you don't pay your labor, the money had to go somewhere. And these trips were one of the places the money went. There's actually a movement to remove the every 4 years restriction because a lot of people in the industry think that if you want to save the foreign trips as a concept, then you need to add the flexibility to go on shorter, less expensive ones more frequently, especially with the amount of roster turnover. That's what a lot of the ADs are pushing for right now. When the athletic department announced that the football team was exploring playing a regular season game in Germany, I recall having a sort of meta reaction. The main thing I noticed was that everyone seemed to be vaguely upset about it, and I thought it was a bad idea that could turn out really cool. I loved that the initial plan was to take Western Michigan, and when Jim Harbaugh was in Rome, he had made it very clear that a European game was an explicit goal of his. When it seemed like it might come to pass, I mostly wondered what took so long. When the men's basketball team had played in London, it was almost a non-event. I don't know why the athletic department abandoned the plan. The kindest theory I have is that they just heard from too many fans that didn't want to lose their 8th game. And if that is the main reason, then valid. Obviously, none of us could have anticipated how the rest of the football season would play out. At the time they announced that they were not going to Germany, the head football coach was supposed to be suspended for that game. Regardless of whatever good intentions the athletic department has, I think it was probably fair to say that their hand was just a little forced. I do think the game's going to happen, though. I'm moving into speculative territory here. I'm saying this as much of an observer of college football as an academic. But I think if it's possible to win a national championship at Indiana, then the traditional Blue Bloods are going to have to continue finding ways to distinguish themselves in the minds of recruits. I think we're within 5 years of a collective bargaining agreement or some other mechanism by which the college football player market becomes way less volatile. And when that happens, I think we'll see Michigan look to Europe again as a way to convince recruits that they're doing something different than other universities that can all offer roughly the same amount of money. The timing wasn't right when it happened, but I want to see it happen. I'm not confident it's a good idea, but I want to continue being a football program, an athletic department, and a university that is willing to take big swings and see what happens. And when that happens, maybe some of you can turn to someone who's not sure about it and say, well, we've been doing it since the very beginning.
That was really fascinating. I had no idea for a lot of those stories. I have a couple questions that I'd like to ask as the host. I have that ability before I open it up to everybody else. But I'm kind of curious, how does Michigan's history of international travel compare with other schools? I mean, you mentioned Toronto and wanting to play Harvard way back then.
Yeah, so the early Eastern football and early Ontario football, McGill's obviously in Quebec, but those are pretty intertwined. And between 1875-ish and 1890-ish, there's a fair amount of exchange between the Canadian schools and the Ivies. I talked about how one of the things that the baseball players had been warned about was that previous teams had not acted well. And I do know we're actually not even the only school that ends up with samurai armor, but But the Ministry of Education in Japan was doing one of those for most years in the late 20s and 30s, and then Michigan eventually came back around again.
A different school each year.
Yeah, I know for a fact Illinois has a very, very similar, like, total number of games, both hosting Japanese teams and playing as a visitor in Japan. So,
the other question I had was, particularly, it's really interesting you were talking about sort of, well, a lot of, I guess I wrote this the wrong term, but sort of smaller sports that do a lot more international trips as part of these NCAA rules. How far back does that go?
So the first one that I think is like under the current regime is a men's basketball trip in 2004 to Canada. But volleyball starts doing it a lot in the mid-2000s. It seems that even though it had been allowed for a lot longer than that, at both Michigan and at other schools, there was a reluctance to take them because your freshmen couldn't necessarily come, where your freshmen could be on campus. But if they weren't in the NCAA clearinghouse, there were some rules that prevented your freshmen from coming, so a lot of schools were reluctant to do it. And then in 2010, the NCAA modified the rules to allow freshmen to come, and that opened the floodgates both here and across the country for like these sorts of Olympic sport international trips. And I also just I do think part of the reason that one of the reasons it's been a big deal in like volleyball is that European pro volleyball is very advanced, especially by comparison to American pro volleyball. And I think giving a sport like that the opportunity to see what it would be like in a country where women's volleyball is, as big as the WNBA at least, I think that's probably a really cool opportunity.
Okay, that's honestly a lot more closer to today than I thought I would have thought.
Yeah.
Is what I have to say to that. The other question I have is, were there any particular sporting events that you would have liked to talk about if you had more time that you didn't? It is okay if not, but.
I would have liked to look more into the second Japanese trip. That would have been what I would have focused on a little bit more.
The 31 one?
Yeah.
Okay. No suit of armor for that?
No suit of armor from that one. It is really cool. It was really fun. That's a crazy building out there, the Museum Services Storage Center. Every museum under the University of Michigan banner shares this weird, huge storage facility. There are animal heads all along the walls that have been donated by Michigan alumni over the years. It's not public, but I hope that one day, once in a while, they start doing tours. I'm a library nerd, so.
And this is my final question. Which of these sporting events would you pick to have attended if you could?
Oh, man. Okay, that's hard. I'm tempted to say the baseball. I would have liked to have gone to baseball in Japan because I think that being in those crowds where baseball is established and it's established in Japan, and the crowds are coming to the game with a lot of intelligence. And I think that would have been really cool to see, where like, yes, it would have been cool to be at the Michigan Racine game, but I don't think the atmosphere would have done for me what I like sports to do for me, where in Japan, absolutely the atmosphere would have been extremely cool. And the players noted it all the time, that the fans routinely cheered for both teams. And they said, one of the players said that American fans could learn a lot about sportsmanship from the Japanese fans.
I mean, I imagine nowadays you don't see much cheering for both teams in any American sporting events. So.
No.
Okay, but in any case, we're going to open it up to the public. Any questions from anybody in our audience, both here or online? If you're here at the observatory, please just raise your hand and don't ask your question until one of our docents can bring you the microphone, because that way our online audience can also hear you. And open it up to all of you.
I just want to say that.
Sorry, please wait for the microphone really quick.
It's not a question. Harvey Straub was our father who went on the Japan trip. And we still have some artifacts from that trip. So you mentioned his name. It sounds like he wrote an article or a history of it.
Yeah, it was. It was while he was still playing, but it is for the Michigan Alumnus, the alumni magazine. It's really well written. Let me get your email after this. But yeah, him and another player. He writes kind of a full tour diary, and I think between the two of them, they cover 4 or 5 pages. It's really good. But that's awesome. Thanks for coming.
How long were they in Japan?
They were in Japan for 3 full weeks. Yeah, so they missed the beginning of the semester, and between the playing out west a little bit, and then the boat ride over there, and being in Japan for over 3 weeks, they missed the beginning of the semester. Some of them missed football season. It was a big thing.
I have a couple of questions, if that's okay. When did they stop playing with the fat football? So a lot of the pictures you show, the ball that the players are holding is a rugby ball. So I call it the fat football. American footballs are a lot slimmer these days. And I just wondered when there was that transition and when they decided that they had to be a regulation size, because I know that Wilson have very strict and rigorous rules as to how big the football is, and it's completely different to a rugby ball and an Australian football. So I just wondered when there was that shift.
The transition happens throughout like the 1880s and the 1890s. I'm not going to get you an exact date, but when I was doing research, I did find like an old Spalding's ad that had an American ball and a rugby ball. And so you can start to see the exact change you're talking about, where the American ball is getting a little bit thinner. But at one point, American companies were producing both and selling them. So, but yeah, sometime in the 1890s.
Is that the idea behind that you could actually throw it with one hand easily? Because throwing a rugby ball with one hand is really quite difficult. You see, whenever you see rugby players passing the ball, they're always holding it. And so, because it's much more controllable like that.
I wouldn't be surprised if that's part of it, but it's not like the forward pass doesn't get introduced for some time after that. So,
and the other question was, when has the Canadian rules always been that it would be several points for carrying the ball over the goal line and scoring what I would call a try? When would that get inverted, where the conversion was called the try?
yeah, so in American football, the switch happens really early. In American football, the switch happens almost by the time we're in Canada. In Canadian football, the Ontario Rugby Football Union and the Montreal Rugby Football Union spend a lot of time in the late 1800s debating this sort of thing. And then when they form the CFL and start calling it Canadian football, by then it has switched. That I don't know exactly the answer, but by the time the two big Canadian rugby football unions merge and just start calling it Canadian football instead.
In the back there.
I think you mentioned the fairgrounds. And to me, I read somewhere, either in the Ann Arbor District Library archives or in some university publication, that the first University of Michigan football game, I don't know how you define that, but that it occurred at the fairgrounds, which to me means Burns Park. And I'm wondering if you have any, have you heard that before, or have any information about that?
Honestly, I do not know offhand. You know, it's funny, I looked up the current status of a lot of the locations I mentioned in my talk, and not that one, but here we are.
What did the word fairgrounds mean, if anything, to you when you were using it?
Well, it is the word that they use, to describe, like, that's how they describe the location.
Right. Burns Park has got the oval shape of a horse track, and where the school currently, the elementary school currently stands, was the city of Ann Arbor's equipment or storage area. So putting all those together, I was thinking that could have been the site of the first University of Michigan football game, but
Yeah, I mean, that seems possible. I think even, back then, I think even getting out there would have been a big schlep from campus. This building also was a big schlep from campus, but they had to do it anyways.
thank you.
Well, if there are no other questions from the audience, I'm going to ask a final question.
Okay.
This is going to be the hardest question of the whole evening for you.
Okay.
How far are the men and the women going in their tournaments?
The men are going to win the national championship, and the women are also listen. I was telling Andrew before this, I put Michigan to win my brackets every single year. And I do very sincerely believe that this edition of Michigan men's basketball can and should win the national championship. I think the women are a very, very serious Final Four contender. I will be disappointed if they get out before the Elite Eight. This is an Elite Eight or better season for Michigan. Next year's the year, though. Michigan women's basketball is a national championship contender next year. I'm dead serious.
Well, you heard it here first, and we will hold him to that. So thank you all for joining us this evening. Thanks as well to Greg Parker, the director of the Detroit Observatory, for monitoring our live stream comments. And also thank you to the Michigan media team for recording our session this evening. For all of you who have registered, a link with a YouTube account that will lead you to this video and this talk will be emailed to you sometime in the next week, where you can look at it forever, share it, forget about it, whatever you'd like to do with it. Our next Making Michigan session will be in 2 weeks from this evening on April 2nd, when former Bentley director Fran Bluen will be joining us to discuss the Bentley's international work in the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s in China, South Africa, Europe, and a whole bunch of other places, and how that tied in to U of M's expanding global reputation and fame. For those of you here at the Observatory this evening, and if you don't want to run out and catch a TV to watch the Michigan game, the original Observatory upstairs will be open. We have student docents to share amazing stories about this really fascinating place and its role in university history. I'm just going to say they do an absolutely incredible job. I cannot sing their praises highly enough. I highly encourage you to take a look if you're here. If you can't stay this evening, or if you're joining us virtually, please come back sometime soon. We are open Thursday afternoons, Friday afternoons and evenings, and on select Saturdays. Thank you all for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, and go Blue.
Go Blue.